Well, welcome back, everyone. Amidst the backdrop of a turbulent 2023 marked by various challenges in security, Nigeria has managed to maintain relative stability. However, 2024 has brought forth a disturbing tempo, particularly concerning the pervasiveness of security risk. The response at both the federal and state levels has been characterized by a strategic security posture involving both kinetic and non-kinetic measures aimed at addressing these concerns. Now, these and more are some of the highlights of the report on security released by Beacon Security and Intelligence Limited. Tonight, we will dissect the report and make gains from the knowledge therein. For that, I'm now being joined by the CEO of Beacon Security and Intelligence Limited, Dr. Kabiru Adamu. He joins me virtually. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Good evening.
So before we get into the very specifics of this report released by Beacon Security, give us, your conclusion on the state of insecurity as captured by the report.
Well, in summary, what we did is because March marks the end of a quarter, the first 3 months of the year. So we collected and then analyzed the security developments that occurred within the month of March and compared it with February. We also collated all the developments that occurred in January, February, and March, which marks the first quarter of 2024, and then compared that with the figures of the first quarter of 2023. In other words, the comparison should be able to give us a sense of whether we're making progress or we're not making progress. And in summary, what we saw first in March is that unfortunately there is an increase we measure 3 major indices. We measure fatalities, in other words, the number of persons that have been killed as a result of security occurrences. We saw an increase of about 9% or thereabout. And then for abduction, we saw an increase of about 30% month to month. The same thing with the quarterly comparison. So first quarter 2023 and first quarter 2024, we also saw a concurrent increase. But what was even more worrisome for us was we divided the regions into the 6 that they are. And then, of course, we brought out the figures for each of the regions. And we were a little bit surprised to see that for fatalities, about 80% of the occurrences affected the northern half of the country. So when you take out the 3 regions in the north, north, central, northeast, and northwest, 80% of the fatalities were for the 3 regions. And then, of course, when we now went to abduction, which was even more worrisome, about 90% of the occurrences affected the northern part of the country. And what that told us is we deploy the inadequate resources that we have in these areas where we saw an increase in security occurrences, then we'll be able to reduce, let's say we reduce that 90% by 50%, would have reduced the security challenges affecting Nigeria by almost about 50%. And so more than anything, this type of collation, this type of analysis gives an indication of where resources can be deployed better, and of course, what the current deployment is able to achieve.
And as I went through that part of the report, it's quite alarming to see the difference between the North and the South. For example, in the Northeast, fatalities as high as about 30-something%, and you find that in the South is as low as about 5%. The disparity is just so much. I will get to that in just a moment. But I wanted to talk about, something you mentioned, and we also talked about it in our introduction, where you said, and I'm quoting, Nigeria managed to maintain relative stability in 2023. However, the onset of 2024 brought forth disturbing tempo, particularly concerning the pervasiveness of security risk. What is responsible for that disruption from, relative peace to security between 2023 and 2024?
So one of the indicators is the socioeconomic challenges. The socioeconomic challenges has increased the structural deficiencies that are making certain components of the society more susceptible and vulnerable to being exploited by the risk and threat elements that exist within the society. So as an example, the ecosystem upon which banditry and the several other threat elements, including the ideological terrorist groups that exist in the northern half of the country, that ecosystem is being fed by different actors. Now, the more people are thrown out of jobs, the more the difficulty for families to feed themselves, the more they are subjected to those structural deficiencies that would make them to be exploited by the threat elements that exist. So as an example, the bandits, they use motorcycles to move from point A to point B. In the last few months, the security forces have reduced the ability of these bandits to access petroleum, just as a very basic example. Now, it's when people are facing such socioeconomic challenges, it's very easy, for instance, to incentivize, especially women, to assist them in procuring this petroleum. Of course, there are other examples, feeding their captives when they abduct people. They, because of some of the socioeconomic challenges within the region, they will find it difficult to come to the market. So they have to depend on that ecospace to continue their activity, sometimes knowingly and other times unknowingly. People aid them in doing this. So this is just an indication of what would have happened. The other one, which is also extremely important, is the increased tempo of security operations. So we've seen an increase in both the interdiction and then the other types of operation by especially the military, including where they've targeted bandit leaders, they've targeted forest areas. But what we didn't see is the cordoning off of those locations. And so we've seen dislocation and we've seen movement of some of these bandits where they now, out of perhaps anger, target vulnerable populations. And then you see the type of bestiality that perhaps even the killing would shock. We've seen instances where women who are pregnant, they're killed, and then the babies in their belly are brought out and also killed out of that bestiality. And then, of course, the other one, which is also very important, is the state governments, and especially the Northwest, have gone ahead to create vigilantes. Kaduna did the same thing, Zamfara, Katsina, and Sokoto. Now, unfortunately, and in spite of advice that we gave, those vigilantes did not follow the right protocol that should have accompanied the creation of such vigilantes. So as an example, the profiling of the members of the operatives, the right training that would have showed them they do not have prosecutorial powers. They can arrest, but they cannot prosecute. So we've seen extrajudicial killings by these vigilantes. We've also seen instances where they're being accused of committing crime, both violent and opportunistic crime. We've also seen instances where they've been accused of gender-related violence against women in those locations. So what that does is that it encourages the groups that they are targeting to also arm themselves and either to protect themselves or in certain instances, increasing the conflict scenario within that region. So these are some of the reasons why we've seen an increase in 2024.
And also because what you're just talking about in terms of vigilante, and if I may use the word going rogue, also tie this into another statement you make, which is the fact that there's a rise in localized self-help, particularly at the state and community levels. Speak more on that kind of self-help and its implications.
So the more the social contract is declining, and the Section 14, subsection 2 of the Constitution is very clear. The responsibility of the state government is to protect people. Now, the more that inability of protection is visible, where communities are being attacked by this threat element that I've described previously, the more these communities seek ways to help themselves. Now, it could be by establishing community-led initiatives, including vigilantes, or it could be the one that worries most of us, by arming themselves. So the proliferation of small arms and light weapons will now continue to increase. You see more weapons in circulation. And of course, the fragility, those indexes that are used in calculating fragility of the state now becomes more visible, where, for instance, the court judicial system is weak. The law enforcement component is also extremely weak. And so what people do is to met out justice in themselves. So if you pick Zamfara as an example, when these vigilantes, these self-help community-led initiatives, when they emerge, one of what they do is to assume who is their enemy. And in this instance, it would be probably, allow me to use ethnic groupings. So most of them are Hausas, and then they assume that their enemies are the Fulanis. And so you see the Hausa vigilante groups attacking the Fulanis. And what the Fulanis will do in return is also to arm themselves. And so before you know it, you see an expansion of the conflict, now wearing some form of ethnic yoga among themselves. And what really fails beyond anything is the authority of the state, because what these groups see is the inability of the state to protect them, and what they're trying to do really is to protect themselves, and in the process, creating more of the conflict that we're seeing. Another indication of this self-help is where you see protest in communities. So they block travel routes by way of drawing attention to their plight. Most of the routes that are affected are busy routes where interstate movement is very common. So once they do that, you see media houses covering that, and then they give them the attention they want. And then sometimes you see the deployment of security forces. And then after a while, those security forces are also deployed back. But this is very common, really, in most parts of the North.
Dr. Kabiru, what you just described in terms of people arming themselves in some of these states, sometimes it is the governors who also encourage these kind of activities, because we've had some governors and notable individuals say, if you're not going to send us security, then my people should arm themselves and defend themselves. Some have even prescribed the kind of ammunition that should be used. Do they understand the implication of what they're asking for and the results that not follows?
Unfortunately, I don't think they do understand. And I think this is where the role of the government, federal government now, in raising awareness and using strategic communication to highlight the consequences of some of these actions. Just today, the Nasarawa state government banned or proscribed all ethnic-based vigilantes. Now, I think this is a realization of the consequences. It took very long for it to realize the consequences of allowing ethnic vigilantes, but now it has realized it, and on its own, it has come out to ban such activities. And I think if the federal government, especially the Ministry of Information, National Orientation Agency, the Office of the National Security Advisor, they need to go on a public sensitization, engage with the governors and explain to them the consequences of allowing or encouraging this type of self-awareness. But before then, the onus and responsibilities for the federal government, especially the Office of the National Security Advisor, to create a framework for addressing the challenge. In this instance, banditry, because banditry is one of the major threat elements. It's not the only one, there are several, but banditry, I think at the moment, is a major threat element in the northern half of the country, especially northwest and north central. So create a framework that would allow the states to tie in so that even when they are creating any state level apparatus, they understand where the powers of that state level apparatus should start and end. There are gaps. I don't want to leave this conversation with the impression that I don't think there are gaps. There are gaps within security structure, architecture, deployment at the state and at the local level. And those gaps need to be blocked. And one of the best ways to block that gap is to incorporate whatever support the governors are ready to give. But that must be done through a framework that the federal government should provide. And I think the best office to do that is the Office of the National Security Advisor, so that where the governors even create those structures, they know ab initio what the powers of those structures should be. As an example, intelligence. It would be very nice to increase the capacity of this state-level creations to gather and contribute to the intelligence generation capacity at the federal level, because they understand their communities, they understand threat elements in those communities. So if you arm them with very little training and perhaps with very little equipment, I wouldn't want to expand it more than that. they will be able to contribute to the gathering of intelligence and the generation and sharing of that intelligence. The other component is the early warning component that this state-level operations can also support. Because they are embedded within the communities, they will be able to understand both in terms of the stressors as well as any factor that could serve as a threat. So the moment those factors show themselves or any stressors show themselves, they will be able to use the early warning mechanism, raise consciousness, and then, of course, the federal institutions can come in to either neutralize that threat element or in certain instances to contain whatever it is before it becomes bigger and we see the type of mass casualties that we're seeing at the moment. So point is, they have a purpose, but that purpose must be guided within the framework of our national security aspirations.
And I want you to speak to those gaps, because I know you've talked about the solutions to those gaps, but the report also mentioned or talked about the ineffectiveness of measures taken by both the federal and state governments. Because what we hear most times rather is that they condemn the attacks and then say, well, on top of it, investigation is ongoing to, the usual term is apprehend the perpetrators and ensure that they are brought to book. You know, that's the usual language. But you are now saying that some of those measures being taken are ineffective. And I want you to talk about the loopholes in those measures.
So the federal government in particular is doing a lot. I don't want to give the impression that I don't think they're doing a lot. And I'm quite excited with the contents of the Renewed Hope agenda. I'm also very excited with the deliverables that the President Bola Tinubu Ahmed administration has encapsulated, the 8-point agenda, as it were. What is missing in all of this is the accountability element. With all sense of responsibility, if there is anything I'm going to recommend to the president is to introduce accountability. Now, the process has started. The president signed, an agreement, as it were, with the ministers, and the ministers have promised to meet the key performance indicators, the deliverables as enshrined in that agreement between him and them. This was signed in October last year, or early November, if I remember well. And then, of course, the president has given the responsibility for managing that process to his special advisor on policy and coordination. And just a week ago or thereabout, the special advisor told us that she's going to use 3 mechanisms, as it were, to measure the performance of these ministries. She has introduced a citizen tracker app, allowing every Nigerian to contribute to the process. So in the area of security, as an example, as a Nigerian, you can jump on that app and tell the government whether you're happy with the provision of security or not. The other component is that the ministries themselves will be able to contribute. And then the last one will be sector expert. Expert will be asked to look at the whole process and then give their professional conclusion on whether there is progress or not. Of course, they will be engaging with the ministries to understand the baselines that were developed. And then, of course, if there were KPIs, key performance indicators, the measurement that has been agreed for showing progress in the implementation of or the meeting of those KPIs. So once all of these 3 is done, I think at the end of a quarter, and we're at the end of that quarter, we're in April, the first quarter has ended. So I'm hoping that Mrs. Adiza would release her report at some point where she would advise the president on progress or not. And if she does it dispassionately and in an unbiased manner, what I'm advising is that those ministers who perform should be commended. And of course, if there is any form of rewarding them, we should reward them. But those ministers who don't perform, whatever the consequences, the penalty for not performing, if it means changing their portfolios, if it means easing them out and bringing people who can perform, I'm strongly encouraging that should be done. And there is no sector where the effect of this will be felt better than in the security sector. If you pick our report as an example, I just told you at the beginning of our conversation that by measuring the month-to-month performance, comparing February to March, we've seen an increase in security occurrences. In other words, the performance of the security sector coordinators need to be improved. What we would like to see is a decrease and not an increase. The one that increased even more is abduction, especially in the northern half of the country. So I'm hoping that if this type of measurement is adopted and done by the Central Delivery Coordination Unit that the Special Advisor on Policy and Coordination is heading, and then the President is advised accordingly. And of course, the reasons for non-performance is also spelled out clearly to Mr. President. I'm hoping that the consequence of this non-performance would be implemented. Again, there are several options available to the President, but what it would do, it would now encourage better performance. If that person is left on that desk, he knows that in the next 3 months, his or her performance will be measured. And if he fails to meet, imagine an exam where there are cutoff points, 60% or 50% or 40%, and then the student fails to meet that cutoff point. Of course, the student will be awarded a pass or a failure. And of course, if he's even given a second option and he still fails, of course, the consequences will be clear. So believe there is nothing more than this that I think is the reason. This is what President Buhari failed to do. He invested massively in security. At the moment, the Nigerian Air Force has one of the best platforms that any Air Force can hope for, at least in Africa. But what happened? Because this consequent management that I've just described was not followed by that administration, we've seen the result. At the end of the 8 years of the administration, the number of Nigerians that were killed is inglorious. About 70,000 Nigerians were killed within those 8 years. So I wouldn't want the current president to leave that type of legacy. And the best way he can avoid that is to implement the provisions of the Renewed Hope agenda, and then also follow through with the consequence management for where there is performance, he rewards it, and where there is no performance, he, of course, take the necessary steps.